The Origins of Norman Studios, Eagle Film City is the title of my pitch. Next slide. So basically, and I'm sure many of you are aware that Jacksonville was known at the front end of the last century as the winter film capital of the world. And the way that came about, a lot of New Yorkers, films were made up in New York, New Jersey. A lot of wealthy people had a direct rail line down to Jacksonville. It was basically the Miami, Florida, what it is today, but it was the vacation land. And so a lot of these people were heading up film production companies. And they said, wintertime, it's very cold up here. You know, it creates problems in terms of the actors, the crew being out in the cold. You only have winterscapes to shoot in. Plus, technologically, it really had played issues with the film in the gate. It would fog up, it would not run. So they were thinking, well, for the wintertime, let's go down to Jacksonville, build a studio down there, and we'll keep on rolling. So next slide, please. So really, this period was from about 1908 to 1917. A lot of studios popped up in town, approximately 30 at one time, I think it was. On the upper left was the first one. That was the Calum Studio. They came in 1908. On the bottom right, Thanhauser Film Corporation. They came down from New York, had a big operation down here. And then on the left is Clutho Studios. They started later in the game, in the more late teens. They were kind of late to the party. Next slide, please. So let's talk about Marcel Perez, the international mirth maker. And what does he have to do with Jacksonville? So Marcel Perez, he was born in Madrid, Spain in 1885. By 1907, he was in Italy making films, comedies. He was very well known from that point on in Europe. Some of his films were released here in the US. So he was, next slide, he was a fairly major player in the comedy business on film. His character that he played was called Robinette, or Robinet, and he was in, I think, about over 150 films over in Italy before he immigrated, next slide, to, of all places, Jacksonville. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Next slide. So at the same time Marcel Perez was coming over to Jacksonville, the Eagle Film Manufacturing and Producing Company that was based in Chicago decided, it's too cold up here. Let's make our permanent operations in Jacksonville. So basically they packed it up in December of 1915. Next slide. They came down and they bought a property in the Arlington area. And they started building. Next slide. And my understanding is that the production, what's called the production building, that still stands today, was a tobacco house, if I'm not mistaken. And it was already existing. So they bought this big parcel of land around the tobacco house. And then, next slide, in addition to that building, they built a number of other buildings. Next slide. And these buildings include a production building, a stage set, costume cottage, props garage, pump building. It had the facility had an entire waterworks system put in, electric power plant, because at that time Arlington didn't have any electricity, and a fireproof film vault to store the nitrate film that was so flammable it could catch really easily fire. So next slide. So they invested a lot of money. And so when they initially came down, basically they were creating two series, one of which was The Adventures of Duffy. These were short films. They were only like 10 minutes long. They were called one-reelers. But these are a couple stills from The Adventures of Duffy series. Unfortunately, I don't think any have survived to this day. Next slide, please. So, while all this is happening, what's happening on Riverside Avenue? Next slide. So the Vim Comedy Company took over this building from Lubin Film Studios, which was acquired this facility in, I think it was 1914. So they took it over in 1915. And what's interesting about this location is that it is on Riverside Avenue, across the street, just down maybe a block from where the Cummer Mansion had been, where Cummer Museum is today. It was in a very high-end neighborhood. It's among mansions. So you have very wealthy people in their neighborhood, and you have a comedy company with all these people with all this makeup, all these funny costumes, running around the streets. It must have been bizarre. It really must have been bizarre. But what's significant about Vim is, next slide please, this is where Oliver Hardy of Laurel and Hardy started his career. He came down here from Georgia, Milledgeville, Georgia, in 1913. He did some cabaret singing and all that with the intent of getting into the film business. He did with Lubin. Lubin goes out of business. I think he went up to New York for a couple months to find work. He hated New York, came back down, and he found out that the Vim Comedy Company had bought the building and they were operating. They signed him on. So here are a few shots of his work at Vim. The one on the bottom right is with Kate Price, who he co-starred with. And you'll notice one of the Riverside mansions right behind him. Whether this mansion still stands, I don't know. But he was teamed with Billy Rouge, who was an acrobat, and they were billed as Plunk and Runt. So that was his first teaming with another comedian. Next slide. So this is the Vim Comedy Company in 1916. Next slide. And there is Oliver Hardy. Next slide. And there is Marcel Perez. So Marcel Perez, he came down, Vim signed him as their lead comedian. Next slide. And he was in a series of films, I think they made about 6 or 7, that his character was known as Bungles. So in Europe he was known as Robin. Here he billed himself as Bungles. Oliver Hardy, since he was the lead, supported him in terms of these films. Next slide, please. So he was with Vim for a short while, and then Eagle Film City, the folks over there must have made him an offer he couldn't refuse. So he went over, signed on with them. So Marcel Perez, he built himself now as Tweedledum. He really had an identity crisis, I think, because every time he'd go to a different studio, he'd come up with a different funny name. But he appeared in, I think it was 12 of these Eagle comedies, 5 of which is very surprising, 5 of which still exist today, and you'll see one tonight, hopefully. And they're in very good condition. They're in the vaults of several with the Library of Congress up in Culpeper, Virginia, and I think the other 1 or 2 are up in New York with the Museum of Modern Art. Next slide, please. So the film we're going to see tonight is courtesy of Undercrank Productions. I have no financial interest in this, nor does Norman Studios. I put these up here just in case you're interested after tonight in seeing more of his work. The 2 DVDs contain work that he did in Italy, that he did at Eagle Film here in Jacksonville, and work that he did at other comedy companies after he left Jacksonville when he went out to Los Angeles. So those 2 DVDs, and then Steve Massa, I know Steve and Ben quite well, they're fellow film historians, wrote a brief biography of Marcel Perez. That's on the right. Next slide, please. So here are some frame grabs that I created from the films that Steve and Ben had put on the DVD. This is from A Busy Night, which we're going to see tonight. And what's interesting, if you look at some of these frame grabs, you see Jacksonville. That is the, I think I haven't been around long enough, the Morocco Temple, what used to be known as the Morocco Temple. It looks today like it looked back then. And it, like the Norman Studios, is on the historic preservation list of historic places. Over to the right, that I think is Atlantic Beach, because they would have taken the shortest route to the beach to film this because time is money. That back then, I think Atlantic Boulevard existed. They would have gone straight out, dead end right there. I think there's a hotel right behind where we're standing now. On the far right is Riverside, a neighborhood of Riverside. Arlington, to my knowledge, was very rural back then, no neighborhoods at all. And Marcel Perez got to know the lay of the land when he was shooting with Vin in terms of neighborhoods to shoot it in Jacksonville. Riverside was the thing. To the left, if you'll notice, that behind him is the production building. It still stands on Arlington Road. That is the museum. In the middle, I guess that's, you people will know better than me, like Jacksonville Country Club, maybe? I don't know. Next slide, please. Here's another one, Lend Me Your Wife. So, scenes here, we have the dock area, I think it was south of the city. We have the probably 5 Points area in Riverside. To the right, to the left, another Riverside neighborhood. Maybe that's a trolley that ran through Riverside. What street that is, I don't know. There's a stage set down on the bottom that I'll get to a little later in the presentation. Next slide. So a Scrambled Honeymoon, another classic. You see Riverside Park up on the left, looking very much today like it looked back then. Just the streets of Riverside, that's probably based on the width of the street. On the bottom middle is probably Riverside Avenue. And again, 5 Points, a little establishment there, one of the mansions. Next slide. Some hero. You see Riverside Park again. Riverside Park served as the background for a lot of different comedies. Oliver Hardy shot there. Pretty much every comedy company in town would go there. On the far right, on the top, you see downtown Jacksonville, as it looked back in 1960. You see Riverside neighborhood there. Downtown, I think, again, you folks would probably know better than me, that may be First Baptist Church behind him. I don't know. On the bottom right, again, is the studio itself. That's the swimming pool that they had on the property that's now buried under the property. What is intriguing about these films and what makes them important is not just that they were entertainment, national entertainment and international entertainment that was created here in Jacksonville. It documents in motion what Jacksonville was like back in that period. Next slide. So, what happened? So 1917, a lot of the comedy companies left town. Next slide. So the movie folks, they were a little wild, a little crazy, and thank you. And so basically, they brought a lot of income. They really generated a lot of revenue for the city. But after a time, I think some of the folks in town thought, enough is enough, it's not really worth it. So politically, a new mayor was elected. They clamped down on the movie business, didn't really give them any enticements to stay here. So Los Angeles, Hollywood, said, come on out here. So they went on out there. And next slide, please. You'll notice one remaining structure there. So basically, after leaving town, Marcel Perez, I think he first went up to New Jersey, made a few films, then found his way down to San Antonio, Texas, made 1 or 2 more comedies there, and then permanently out to Los Angeles. What happened to him is he made a lot of films in Los Angeles. I think it was around 1922, 23. He was diagnosed with cancer in one of his legs and had to have it amputated. So essentially that ended his screen career, but he wasn't out of the business. He went behind the scenes because he directed all of his own films. And he directed other comedians while he was appearing in films. So basically he just went behind the scenes permanently But that only lasted until about, I think, early 1929, and he passed away. So, next slide. So what happened to Bay Hardy? And I say Bay Hardy, not Oliver Hardy, or Ollie, because he was known as Bay. That was his nickname that he kept throughout his life. And what's interesting is that he acquired that nickname, which he loved. His family called him Bay, his friends, his co-workers called him Bay. He was Bay off camera, never Ollie, never Oliver. He acquired the nickname Bay in Riverside. In 1914, when he was working for Lubin, he and other players went to an Italian barber in town to get a shave. We'd get the shave, and the Italian barber, each time he'd shave, he'd like pat his cheeks going, nice a baby, nice a baby. And all, like these other guys with him were giving him a bad time, hey baby. And then it turned into Bay, and it stuck. So he was known as Bay Hardy off screen, and he also received screen billing in different comedies as Bay Hardy. Next slide. So after Hardy left Jacksonville, he went out to Los Angeles, and he worked, this was 1917, he worked for the next 10 years supporting other comedians, big comedians in the short comedy field, like one and two reelers. Larry Seaman, Jimmy Aubrey, Billy West. The one up there was a film made in 1925 where he was actually teamed with a comedian, Bobby Ray, and he considered that to be kind of the first Laurel and Hardy pairing. But then that ended. And next slide, please. And in 1927 at Hal Roach Studios, Laurel and Hardy were created, which is the best comedy, in my opinion, the best comedy team ever to appear on the screen. And so the rest is history on that one. Next slide. So I bring this up just, again, just for reference. This is a Blu-ray set that contains virtually all of Hardy's work here in Jacksonville that still exists. A lot of it has been lost to time and deterioration, plus a lot of other work he did on his own, and Stan Laurel on his own. This was put out by a friend of mine, Serge Bromberg, who's over in Paris with Lobster Films, who does excellent work. What's exciting, actually, in April-May timeframe, next slide, another comedy cohort of mine, Rob Stone, who is the film curator at the Library of Congress, is publishing a book, Pokes and Jabs, about the history of the Vim Comedy Company. It's going to be very in-depth as far as Vim's history in Jacksonville. Next slide, please. And again, I have no financial interest in those. Norman Studios doesn't. I just bring them up as reference. So, Jacksonville, after 1917, Eagle Film had gone away like all the others. They left this property, it's deserted. So, in 1920, next slide please, Richard Norman, who was from this area originally, outside Middleburg, he was born and raised in. He came back to town and started his work, next slide please, creating, as Rita outlined, the race films. Very important part of film history, and one that's been very, very neglected. What Rita did not mention, and I didn't think I heard her mention, the Flying Ace. Just a couple of months ago, the Library of Congress included it on the National Film Registry, which is a big deal. That means the Flying Ace, Congress has designated this as being an historic film, a treasure of the United States cinema. So very, very important. And I mean, kudos to Richard Norman. But Richard Norman, throughout the 20s, it's beyond the winter film capital of the world era. Richard Norman is working his magic here in Jacksonville until sound came in, and then I think he couldn't afford the sound equipment, so went into industrial production and that type of thing. Next slide, please. So, the push now at the studios is the museum is to try to acquire this building, which is the stage set building. It's a very, very important part of the whole museum. Really, it's not a complete museum unless that is part of it. And next slide, please, and I'll explain why. Because basically, the stage set building was where they stored a lot of, obviously, sets, but they shot outside under a big tarp. It looked kind of, it was a big canopy that diffused the sun, but they would shoot interior types of sets on those, like the one on the top left. And you can always see when this was being done because on a windy day, the curtains on windows would just be flying all over the place. It was a dead giveaway. So basically, on that property in back of the building, a lot of film was shot. Also, on the lawn out by Arlington Road is where the pool is buried. Now, the pool was not a recreational pool. It wasn't like, okay, in the Florida Sun, cast and crew, go take a dip between takes. It was a functioning piece of the studio. Next slide, please. It was used for water scenes, like that. So it's a very important piece of the property. The danger if another party buys this property, they can't do a lot, at least to my knowledge, to the outside of the building, because it is on the historical register. But they could build on top of where the pool is. They could put an auto body shop there. And there goes that piece of history. So it's very important that in somehow, some way, the museum acquires this property. Next slide, please. So what happened to all this stuff that Eagle Film Company put in there back in 1916? Next slide. It's all there. Rita, when I moved down, Rita gave me a tour, and my jaw hit the floor. So much of the original things that were part of the studio well over 100 years ago are still there. I mean, you see the electrical panels, you see the film vault that was used to store the nitrate film that was very flammable. On the upper right, you see the screening room where Marcel Perez watched dailies. And the reason he was able to watch dailies was Eagle Film was very innovative because companies up to that point shot the film here and they shipped it back up to New York, either by rail or boat, processed it up there, and then back down here to cut it. So Eagle Film put in their own lab to process the film. So they have it like that. But it's just amazing that everything is still there and it's original. Okay, next slide. And so we got the museum talking about purchasing this property that needs to be added to it. But then, even if that happens, you're looking at a lot of funds that are going to be needed to add to the exhibitry, as Rita mentioned, to do this, to do that, get some kind of cultural events going, educational events. It's a lot of stuff, staff, whatever, it's boggling my mind. But, so, essentially, anybody and everybody who can get the word out, please get the word out. And next slide, please. And ask them to go to normanstudios.org and hit the donate button. And that's my spiel.